folks can who are not able to join us can catch up with us later. So thank you very much for joining us. My name is Kim Ross. I'm the co-executive director of ReThink Energy Florida. You are joining us on our three-part webinar. And the title for tonight's webinar is Incineration, We Can't Burn Our Way Out of the Waste Crisis. 22 years ago, the UN issued a press release about a global garbage crisis. And since then, various technologies have been developed and marketed as the best way to address our mounting waste woes. Some even claim that waste is a benefit when burned to generate electricity. It's no secret that the burning of trash, regardless of how it is burned, carries inherent health risks due to contamination of our air, water, and land. And so we are starting this journey as a three-part series tonight, and then March 26th and April 23rd, we'll have an in-depth discussion about the dangers of incineration, the benefits of zero waste, and what it'll take to move Florida and the nation away from incineration and toward zero waste. And so thank you all for joining us. The event, and Brian, you can go ahead and share the slides if you would please. The event tonight is brought to you through the collaborative efforts of Floridians Against Dirty Energy, or FADE, Earth Ethics, GAIA, ReThink Energy Florida, Florida Rising, Broward Clean Air, and Climate Reality North Broward and Palm Beach County. And in particular, this webinar series is coinciding with the Climate Reality North Broward and Palm Beach Counties monthly meetings, as their focal campaign for 2024 is solid waste management. Just a couple of housekeeping moments. We want you to feel free to put your questions in the chat, but in general, we're going to save the questions for the end. And also ask that you save your discussion for the end and kind of the chatting back and forth. We'll have plenty of time for discussion, but just so we can be able to key in on the questions when we do get to the Q&A portion, that will help us if you just put questions in the chat. Okay, next slide, Brent. So our series tonight is going to feature Mackenzie Marcelin, Dr. Neil Tangri, and Jessica Roth. And so, next slide. First, we want to present for you Mackenzie Marcelin. Mackenzie is a climate justice director at Florida Rising. He's a Florida native who works as a climate justice director for Florida Rising. And he works to build towards a future based on the principles of climate justice and just transition to ensure our Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities are leading and not left behind as we develop solutions for the climate crisis. He believes that by addressing the problems through a climate justice lens, we can transition toward a more equitable and stronger future where our environment and local systems can contribute to the health and well-being of our communities. And so without further ado, I would like to bring you Mackenzie.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm going to be sharing my screen. Just give me 1 second. All right, let's see. All right. Thank you, Kim, for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to be going over pretty briefly just the state of incineration in Florida, kind of give you the lay of the land, how many incinerators we have, what are some of the impacts, and what are the current happenings in Florida when it comes to incineration. Just so y'all know, just incineration refers to a process of burning solid waste at a high temperature to produce energy, clean it, it's dirty energy, but that's what it's defined as. And within Florida, there are 10 incinerators that are in Florida. One actually was burned down just a year ago in Miami, in Doral, Florida. But I, just wanted to include that in there because there's still an ongoing fight as far as that, but it is for the time being closed. So we have 10 incinerators in Florida. That is the most in the United States. We are, officially the capital of incineration when it comes to the United States. And the companies that are currently operating facility, either operating or owned, facilities are Covanta at 6, and Wheelabarter at 2, and then Babbitt and Wilcox at 2. So those are the you can see where it's mapped out. This is a map that I created myself, just kind of lay it out where they're located. There's a big chunk in that Tampa region, South Florida region. We have some in the Central Florida, and near Fort Myers as well. Um, uh, all right, next slide. Yeah, so this is the list of all the incinerators in Florida, and from my knowledge, then the website that this guy that I gathered the amount of waste that they produce per year. You can see just based on the slide, many of these incinerators are decades old. I believe the Palm Beach the Palm Beach incinerators received some upgrades, I believe in 2015, but these facilities are decades old, near the end of their life cycle. And as you can see, they produce a lot of tons of they burn uh, uh, tons of waste per year. At Palm Beach facility being nearly at 1 million. I believe the facility in Pascal County is looking to expand and uh, uh, burn create a facility that can burn up to 1 million as well. Miami-Dade is also looking to after the burning of the burning of incinerator, looking to build a new one as well that is over, I believe, around 1.4 million tons. I think 4,000 tons of tons of waste per day. So those are kind of just a list of them, and laid out, and you can know that the year that's been established, and then the waste that they take in per year. And I think this stat may need some work, but nearly 500,000 Floridians live within 3 miles of Florida's incinerators. 9 of the 10 are located in environmental justice communities. That's communities of color and low-income communities that already has a disproportionate impact, environmental justice, impact that they're already facing. So we have a good chunk. Nearly all of the incinerators are placed in black, brown, low income communities that are already facing a whole host of environmental issues. And if y'all aren't aware, about I'm sure you all are. Incinerators, they emit toxic air pollutants that are harmful to our overall health. They contain heavy metals, dioxins, lead, mercury, and particulate matters as well. And these toxins can lead to a number of health problems such as asthma, kidney, lung disease, and other terrible diseases and harmful effects. And so, the fact that these are placed in Black and brown communities of already facing a massive amount of disparities is just a further injustice, further reason to show that we should not have these incinerators, being built. And that's just a photo of us doing an action prior to the incinerator burning down. We were really focused on shutting down doing our best to shut down the incinerators. But due to the negligence of the company that facilitated, operating that, it led to it burning down. And now we're just trying to work to stop in Miami-Dade from building a new one. And this is a photo I pulled from a spreadsheet that actually was provided by GAIA. that kind of lists out the air pollutant emissions from each of the incinerators. Um, as you see, there's tons of lead, particulate matter, mercury, and you can see the waste capacity of much of these incinerators. Um, you know, these are extremely harmful. We don't want any of these pollutants being emitted. You can see that Pinellas is one of the larger facilities are emitting tons of mercury and particulate matters that, again, like I mentioned, are extremely harmful to our communities. Environmental impacts, I don't think I need to go into those, but obviously they have incinerators. They're a source of greenhouse gas emissions. They primarily are emit carbon dioxide, and they are when the incinerators are burned, they leave a toxic ash that are primarily just dumped into landfills, and have a significant contamination in the soil and land, and that can cause detrimental effects, and also of the waters as well. Something that's kind of just really relevant when it comes to energy in Florida. Incineration is considered a renewable energy resource, or a new renewable energy source. And what that means for us is, for Floridians, is that these incinerators are primarily held by renewable energy subsidies that comes from our tax dollars. And unfortunately, the energy that is produced is one of the dirtiest and most costliest form of producing energy. And it's unfortunate that it is considered a renewable energy. But that just means we got work to do in Florida. Um, this is kind of just laying out, like, and I'll talk more about it just with my words. But this is kind of where we're at when it comes to incineration in Florida. We're seeing the rise of we saw the Pascal County put in nearly $500 million in expanding their incinerator. There were talks in Broward County about pushing forward and building another incinerator there. We have Miami-Dade that are willing to invest $1.4 billion to produce another incinerator facilities. And like I mentioned prior, there's a number of health and environmental impacts that are extremely harmful. We want to really try and advocate and really push for Florida and our elected officials to move away from incineration, because of all the things that I've mentioned to prior. To go along with that, there was actually a bill 2 sessions ago, and I can drop that in there for you, that actually that opened a fund to that local municipalities be able to access to get more grant money for incinerators. And so within Florida Rising, we saw that as a harmful, extremely harmful thing for our communities. We want to stop the expansion because, again, Florida, while we're in the direction of expanding and adding more incineration, this goes against the overall trend in United States, where we're declining. There's an extreme decline, especially in the past few decades, of incineration. And so we want to make sure that we're not going in the opposite direction in Florida, and we want to move forward. And so we put forward a bill that essentially before before any municipality access that pot of money, that they do environment, that they meet EPA environmental standards, and then also they set up a air quality monitoring system, and if they meet those things, then possibly they can gain access to that funds. But the idea is to hinder as much as possible the funding of incineration within Florida. And so we're trying, different things, different ways to halt it, and that's just one of those things. So yeah, that's kind of just the brief layout of the of incineration in Florida that I wanted to give you a lay of the land. And yeah, and we'll be saving questions for the end, so I'll pass it back to Kim.
All right, thank you so much, Mackenzie. No, Mackenzie's just fantastic. So our next presenter is Neil Tangri, Dr. Neil Tangri. So let me give him an introduction. He is the Science and Policy Director at GAIA, which is a global network of more than 1,000 organizations in 92 countries that are working towards zero waste and environmental justice. He's also a senior fellow at the University of California, Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy. A climate scientist and oceanographer by training, Neil has worked on a variety of issues, including waste management, plastics, chemical recycling, waste incineration, zero waste systems, carbon markets, informal sector inclusion, offset credit systems, PVC and mercury bans, municipal water supply, lead poisoning, marine plastic pollution, climate finance, carbon markets, and informal sector inclusion. He has a PhD from Stanford University and holds a captain's license from the U.S. Coast Guard. Neil.
Thank you very much. All right, let me share my screen with y'all, and hope you can see that. And yeah, I'll dive in. I'm going to talk primarily today about greenhouse gases and the impact on climate from incinerators. So that's only one of the many issues that Mackenzie was highlighting with incineration, but obviously it's an important one in its own right. It's also important, particularly because of subsidies that derive from greenhouse gases. So it should be obvious that whenever you have giant smokestacks like you do from an incinerator, you've got a lot of emissions, and that obviously is going to contribute to climate change. But the industry is desperately trying to have us believe that incinerators are actually a climate solution instead of a climate problem. And that rests on two arguments. The first here is that incinerators produce clean, and I'm definitely putting that in quotes, clean energy. And the second is that they avoid landfill emissions. So let's go through those arguments in turn. This is just a sampling of statements from industry spokespeople about how wonderful their energy producing waste burners are. They, of course, like to call it clean energy. The reality is that incinerators produce 0.3% of the US grid's electricity. And that data is a couple years out of date, so it's actually going down now. It is not a significant source of electricity, which in particular means that the electric grid does not depend on it. It would be very easy to stopgap that, to fill that energy source with other energy sources. So they produce very little electricity, but they produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So let me just walk you through this chart. Each bar here represents a different power source, MSWI, or municipal solid waste incinerators. The others are fairly obvious, landfill gas over there. Gas is your fossil gas. And then all is the grid average. So this is national data across the United States. And the height of the bar represents the greenhouse gas emissions per kilowatt hour of electricity produced. So it's kind of an efficiency metric, right? For a given amount of electricity, how much greenhouse gases does each source emit? And obviously, as you can see here, incineration is by far the most polluting electricity source we have. Another thing that's notable is that it is the only source that emits very high levels of both fossil carbon and biogenic emissions. Now, for those of you who are not deep in the weeds of this, the difference may not be obvious, but fossil emissions comes from fossil fuels, coal, gas, as well as burning plastic, which is basically a fossil fuel. Biogenic emissions come from organics, wood, paper, and food waste. So what's the difference? Why do we distinguish them? Well, the incinerator and biomass industries like to pretend that for some reason, biogenic carbon dioxide doesn't count. We're just going to make it disappear. We're not going to count it, right? They have all kinds of funny arguments that have been scientifically completely debunked, but they just don't count those emissions quite often. And that, of course, makes their emissions look much lower. But the fact is, it's carbon dioxide. It goes into the atmosphere and it heats the planet just like carbon dioxide from fossil fuels. I also want to draw your attention to that little yellow band in here. That's methane and nitrous oxide. Those are powerful greenhouse gases. And incineration is a small but significant source of those. So what does all of this mean? One thing is that if incinerators do displace other energy sources, they're displacing energy sources with lower emissions. In other words, to the extent that anybody is getting their electricity from an incinerator, it means they're not getting it from some other more efficient, cleaner source of electricity. Or to put it another way, if we were to close the incinerators and get our energy from other sources, our total grid emissions would go down. And that would be true even if we replace them with fossil fuel sources, which obviously we don't want to do, but that would be a worst case scenario. Now, in spite of that, most states like Florida define incineration as renewable energy. And the way that this works is that utilities buy renewable energy credits in order to meet their requirement to produce renewable energy. And they buy those credits in many cases from incinerators. So even in states that don't have incinerators, they may be buying Florida credits from Florida incinerators. These credits are called RECs, renewable energy credits. So Florida incinerators will sell their RECs anywhere in the country, depending on where the market is. REC sales annually are around $41 to $44 million a year. That's my estimate. This data is very hard to come by, but that's my best estimate. And those energy sales are what's keeping incinerators in business. How do we know that? Well, Covanta tells us that, for one thing. They say that if they don't have the REC sales, they're going to go out of business, which sounds like a good idea to me. And we see that in California because California law has kicked incinerators out of the REC system, and our last two incinerators are closing. And specifically, one of the reasons is because they can no longer generate sales. They can no longer generate energy from sales of those credits. So RECs, including incinerators in the renewable energy standards, not only props up the incinerator industry, it also is diverting money that really should be going to clean energy, right? So it's undermining renewable energy laws. Now, that's at the state level. On top of these state subsidies, the incinerator industry is trying to get federal subsidies, like under the IRA, to further prop them up through claiming to be renewable energy. Okay, so that's the energy side. But the industry does admit, when you press them, that the energy generated from incinerators is really very small. The important thing from a climate perspective is the avoided landfill methane emissions. And it is true, landfills emit a lot of methane, about 20% of all anthropogenic methane. This is the red circle here is our primarily landfill emissions from North America. So methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. In fact, it's 81 times as powerful as carbon dioxide on a short 20-year time scale. Now, incinerators emit both carbon dioxide as well as nitrous oxide and small amounts of methane. So when you switch from landfills to incinerators, you're really just switching from methane to carbon dioxide. We're swapping one greenhouse gas for another. And since we need to eliminate all greenhouse gases, that's clearly not a solution. Fortunately, incinerators and landfills are not the only options, believe it or not, right? So landfill methane is generated by decomposition of organic waste. That's mostly your food waste and yard waste. And there are lots of ways to reduce landfill methane by reducing the organic waste that's going into the landfills, right? Here's a nice chart from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance that shows you, the first thing we want to do is avoid food waste altogether, right? Food that is grown should be eaten, preferably by people. So get the excess food to people who will eat it. Failing that, get it to animals and feed them. Failing that, you can compost it. At the very least, you treat it before it goes into the landfill. It's called biostabilization so that it doesn't generate methane in the landfill. The point is, there are lots of things that you can do with organic waste that don't involve just landfilling it and generating methane, right? So here, near where I live, San Francisco is known for diverting 80% or more of its organic waste to compost. That compost sells at a premium because it's going to organic vineyards. All those nice California wines are buying San Francisco compost because it's clean. Overseas in Seoul, the city of Seoul, a mega city of 10 million people, they collect 96% of their organic waste, and it goes to compost and animal feed. Other cities have had success with biodigesters, with black soldier fly. There's all kinds of different approaches to composting or to organics treatment, as long as you're not throwing it into the landfill. And all of these avoid landfill methane emissions. So I'm harping on this point because I want everyone to understand that the argument that if we don't burn it, it's going to go to the landfill and cause methane is simply not a valid argument. There are lots of other approaches. Now, I've been talking mostly about greenhouse gases, but as Mackenzie was saying, there are a lot of other impacts here, particularly on human health. And this is because the complexity of modern waste, with all of its plastics, its dyes, metals, electronics, etc., when you burn all of that together, the emissions are an absolute witch's brew of hazardous air pollutants. Incinerators are known to be primary sources, dioxins and furans in air emissions. They're important contributors in many more types of toxic emissions, including heavy metals, particulates, sulfurous oxides, nitrous oxides, much more. And as our chart shows here, those attack a wide range of organs and bodily functions. So it's not the case, unlike asbestos, where you have like one pollutant that leads to one disease in the human body. You can think of incinerators as kind of the shotgun effect. They're attacking the body in multiple different ways through multiple different pollutants, multiple different avenues that hit different organs. So these pose a threat, obviously, to the immediate community that's breathing the air in the vicinity of the incinerator. But it also poses a threat to the larger population because many of these pollutants biomagnify through the food chain, right? Dioxin, mercury, PCBs, these are known to concentrate in foods and work their way up the food chain. And so we see that, for example, indigenous people in the Arctic have some of the highest levels of PCBs in their bodies, despite being nowhere near a PCB source. And that is because they're eating near the top of the food chain. And so the impact is not only to the host community, which obviously suffers the worst impacts, but it can be actually to quite distant communities as well. And the more research we do, the more we find out. So new research is emerging that shows that incinerators are also sources of novel emerging toxic compounds, such as PFAS and hexachloro-1,3-butadiene, which is shortlisted on the Stockholm Convention as a POP. PFAS is, again, something that didn't really exist 20 years ago, but now that we're creating more products with fluorinated carbons, we're going to get more fluorinated emissions when we burn those. The problem is that we don't know what's coming out of that stack until we go and look for it. And doing those tests is often expensive and it's difficult. And of course, the incinerator companies don't want us to do that. So the more we look, the more we find out, and the more disturbing it is, frankly. So we often don't have access to those emissions. So, and this is a common problem around the world, is that it's very difficult to monitor what's going on from the incinerator. So our colleagues in Europe have pioneered this approach called biomonitoring. What they do is they sample chicken eggs, pine needles, and moss that are growing around incinerators and at various distances from the incinerators. They test for dioxins, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PFOS, and other bioaccumulative substances. And the results have really been quite jaw-dropping. So all the chicken eggs that they have tested near incinerators have been contaminated with dioxins to a level that they are not legally allowed to be sold within the European Union. Right? So think about that. If you've got backyard chickens and you've got an incinerator within, say, 2 or 3 kilometers from your house, those eggs are like legally not allowed to be sold. Pine needles and mosses, other biomonitoring media, are showing similar levels of contamination. The highest contamination levels are nearest the incinerator, of course, unsurprisingly. So we know the incinerator is the source, it's not something else. And the contamination persists up to 3.5 miles away. This is true for every incinerator they've tested in Europe, including the newest, most expensive facility in the Netherlands, the Harlingen facility, built in 2011. Now, the Netherlands has the strictest emissions monitoring controls in the world. They're the only country that I know of that requires continuous dioxin monitoring. And because of the monitoring, they're finding more problems. And that incinerator has been shut down multiple times for exceeding emission standards. This is their state-of-the-art, newest, brand new facility. Of course, all of these impacts, the climate impacts, the human health impacts, all of these are avoidable if we just don't burn our trash. And as I was saying earlier, fortunately, there are far better alternatives. So I'm going to wrap up there and hand this back to Kim. Thank you very much. And I'll stick around for questions.
All right, thank you, Neil. So finally, our last speaker for the evening is Jessica Roth. Jessica is the U.S. and Canada Plastics and Petrochem Program Manager at GAIA. Jessica has been fighting for nearly 15 years against climate change and for a sustainable, just energy system, an end to fossil fuel extraction, and for an infrastructure build-out, an end to infrastructure build-up, and to support and center frontline, fence line, and environmental struggles and the voices of Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. Prior to her work in the climate movement, Jessica practiced law for a decade, focusing on civil rights and federal Indian law. She's based in the so-called Brooklyn occupied Lenape, Munsee, and Kansari lands, where she was born and raised. Jessica.
Thanks, Kim, and everyone who's here. Waiting for my
going to share your
go up. Yeah.
You got that, Brian? There you go.
Great. Can you go to the next slide, please? So we all know that plastics is a major threat to our climate. Production and incineration of plastics are on track to emit 2.8 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions per year by 2050, as much as 615 coal plants, and burning through the up to 13% of our quickly shrinking global 1.5 degrees Celsius carbon budget. Plastic begins as a fossil fuel, and greenhouse gases are emitted at every stage of its life cycle. Actually, lifespan. We're making a conscious choice to shift the language so that it's clearly there's a beginning and an end of where plastics start and finish. But it's problematic in oil and gas extraction, transport, plastic production and manufacture, waste management, incineration, and plastic pollution in our environment. Next slide, please. And like with incineration, the toxins emitted throughout the lifespan of plastic have numerous dangerous health impacts that Mackenzie and Neil spoke about, causing cancers, endocrine diseases, reproductive issues, respiratory disease, and many, many others. Next slide, please. I also want to acknowledge here that the language is really important and is constantly changing in this area. Industry came up with, quote, chemical recycling and got so much pushback from the movement, and we shifted to bring a negative connotation to the term. So then they shifted to call it, quote, advanced recycling or molecular recycling or some combination of any or all of those phrases. We're still looking for a good, accurate name to call the technologies. Or open for suggestions if anyone has any, but I'll be calling it chemical recycling throughout. Next slide, please. As of now, the main forms of so-called chemical recycling are pyrolysis and gasification, and they are not recycling, but are greenwashed incineration and a quick tech fix that fixes nothing and in fact makes things much worse. As most of us all know, mechanical recycling is really about changing the shape and the size of the plastic. It's physically sorted, cleaned, chopped up into small flakes, and turned into pellets and repurposed. The plastic stays intact, But with so-called chemical recycling, which in this country at this time is really pyrolysis and gasification, the plastic is broken down into its component polymers and monomers, and industry claims that it is not incineration or combustion because there's a lack of oxygen in the processes that they're operating. They also say that they're taking all kinds of plastics, especially the ones that cannot be mechanically recycled, and especially the contaminated ones, and that they're making virgin quality plastics with no greenhouse gas or toxic emissions, no toxic waste, and they're mostly being turned, in fact, into dirty fuels. Next slide, please. There's different types of incinerators that can be classified according to the kind of thermal process that's used for burning, the furnace, the reactor, or the kind of waste that they burn. And of course, they change the names to profit from incentives, credits, et cetera, from the government, as Neil mentioned, like waste to energy and plastic to fuel, which are often billed as sustainable or renewable energy, as you've heard. And of course, they're really neither. Next slide, please. Because in fact, pyrolysis and gasification are stages of incineration, and the facilities that perform them do in fact have oxygen in the process. Next slide, please. They require huge amounts of energy. They're powered by fossil fuels, often the ones that are being created in the process. So it's actually just a self-sustaining process as opposed to creating a lot of byproduct. Next slide, please. And obviously, when you're putting toxic materials into a process, in this case, the plastics, you get toxics out in many, many forms. Next slide, please. These processes are not either economically or environmentally viable. As you can see, the economic and environmental metrics of pyrolysis and gasification are currently 10 to 100 times higher than for virgin polymers because of the low yields of the monomers suitable for repolymerization and high energy requirements. That's some fancy tech language to say that there's a lot of energy that goes in and there's really poor quality that comes out. And so as a result of that, both the environmental impacts and the economic viability are completely different than what industry is saying. Next slide, please. So not only are they generating massive amounts of hazardous waste and hazardous pollutants, but as Mackenzie talked about with incinerators, they're almost always sited in already overburdened Black and Brown and Indigenous communities, as you can see on the map. Next slide, please. And when our colleagues at NRDC studied the existing so-called chemical recycling facilities, they found that in fact, the majority are producing fuel, not plastic, and many are trucking their quote recyclables to cement kilns, and they're being burned with other toxic materials all across the country. Up until now, for many, many decades, they've been regulated as incineration under the Clean Air Act, though the American Chemistry Council and other industry players are working really hard to get them classified as manufacturing as opposed to waste treatment in order to pull them out of the Clean Air Act oversight and regulations. Wonder why they'd be working so hard to get them deregulated if they were as clean as they claim they are. When they're talking to the public and decision makers, that is. Next slide, please. Because if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And in fact, behind closed doors, industry is telling a completely different story. I attended an industry conference on so-called chemical recycling last spring. The next two slides are from industry partner, the co-sponsor of the conference, which is an industry organization, AMI Plastics. Next slide, please. So they note that there is significant uncertainty in the field, that they haven't been able to prove that they can operate at scale, that they're in fact relying on information from just 1 or 2 or 3 chemical recyclers, which is obviously not a fair pool of information, and that they have a major problem with their feedstock. Next slide, please. And as you can see in this slide, they really need a clean, homogeneous feedstock in order to keep their machines running and to get any real input. In fact, at this conference, the speaker who was showing these slides said she couldn't understand why everybody thought that they were having this magical process, that they could take all these dirty mixed plastics and come out with a beautiful virgin quality when in fact they needed this homogeneous feedstock. And of course, my thought was because you've spent millions and millions of dollars to convince people that that is the case. Next slide, please. So if you're hearing of a new proposal, we have some questions that we've generated at GAIA so that you can ask of the proponents, whether it's business that's actually proposing a facility that they want to build, or your elected officials or other decision makers. And these are key to gather the information to be able to fight the proposals. What is the operational history of the technology? Where has it been demonstrated at scale? Will the project take mixed plastic, and what pre-sorting would be required? A thing to note about this in particular too is that industry is now in a stage where what they're doing is they're actually separating out the different stages of their proposals. So there's a situation right now in Pennsylvania where Encina is proposing a 2-stage chemical recycling facility. So the first stage is only being called, is only for plastic sorting and cleaning and storing, but it is intended to be part of a chemical recycling process in the end. So there's lots of moving pieces that it's really important to find out what they're doing and when. What will the products be and how will they be used and where will they be used? What are the byproducts and how will they be disposed and where? As Neil mentioned, there's really, and as Mackenzie mentioned as well, there's lots of toxins that are left over after burning processes take place. And this is the sort of the dirty little secret of the industry. They claim that when they chemically recycle things, everything is just, beautiful, perfect plastic at the end, and or including some of the pyrolysis oil or other fuels, but they completely ignore anything that would be toxic ash or anything that would need to be landfilled in the end. But in the end of these processes, there is still toxic materials that are going to have to be landfilled. Another important question to know is how much energy would be used and how much water would be used, and showing what is going in to what is coming out, because this is another game that industry is playing where they're claiming fake numbers for how much they're producing that is recycled. And that's a whole other really long conversation that we can have in a follow-up if we'd like to. Next slide, please. So I appreciate the slide. I think it's really accurate. Clearly, chemical recycling is a process or multiple processes that industry is pretending are going to bring us out of the problem of our plastic production, when in fact, the only thing that will change our plastic problem is cutting down on production. And in the meantime, while we're cutting production, we need to also be pulling out the toxins, the added toxins to it, which make it impossible to mechanically recycle and cause so many more emissions and so much more toxic contamination of people and the environment. So it's really critical that we keep on these proposals, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Jessica. So I think what I'm going to do, Brian, if you want to put up that one, that slide that you have that's got the action. We're just going to share this real quick before we go into questions and answers. And in the meantime, I'm going to bring up our speakers to be available for questions. So give me a moment. And then if you do have any questions, throw them in the chat, and then we will also allow people to raise their hands as well. So that we'll take the ones that are in the chat first. So just for those, we always have an action whenever we do a webinar. We want you to be able to take action immediately. And so we're sharing this right now. We're going to come back to it in a minute, but we did want to share this as well as share the link in the chat to the action alert. And this is just basically a letter to your local elected leaders, your county elected leaders, to say, hey, we need to talk about incineration. So we will come back to this. But I did want to just share that just to make sure we got that, and then we'll come back and Brian will explain a lot about how we are going to be doing it. But first, let's take some questions. So Brian, you want to go to the next slide, and or this is fine. I will start with a question. I have a couple of questions that I'll start while people are putting them in their chat, and then I'm going to ask Marcel to also help me with Q&A. But I was just wondering, and this might be a good question for Jessica, although anybody who has it, can you give us an example of a success story where somebody has either transitioned away from an incinerator or has prevented some incinerator from happening. So just wondering, just looking for a little bit like, wow, that's a lot of pollution. How do we successfully transition away from that?
In fact, I can, and Marcel can probably add some to this as well, but one of our member organizations, Valley Improvement Project, is getting an incinerator closed down in Stanislaus County right now in California after fighting a long, hard fight against them. It's happening. At GAIA, we have a failing incinerator project cohort. So it's folks in different member organizations across the country who are fighting to close down their incinerators. And, and I will also say that the chemical recycling proposal that I mentioned in Pennsylvania, they sort of snuck in, but the community didn't let them sneak in, and they have now come up against many regulatory hurdles because the community has been out fighting every step of the way. And they got the first thing they wanted was a waiver of a regulation on building height, and the community came out in force, and the zoning board denied the waiver. So the company has now gone back to the drawing board. So there are stages at which these successes are possible all along the way. It's really critical to get, if you can get in as early as possible, that's obviously ideal, but, all the way to the functioning incinerators that are getting shut down across the country right now. California's got another one potentially on the way as well. I don't know if Marcel would like to add more from or Neil, obviously, as well, or Mackenzie.
All right, Neil or Mackenzie, you want to add anything? If not, I'll bring up another question. Nope. Okay. So I do have, there's a clarifying question that's in the chat, and I just wanted to go ahead and let you answer it out loud. Plastics recycling is actually incineration, is the question. Neil, you want to take that one? I know you took it in the chat, but just
sorry, yeah, Jessica was talking, so I thought Jessica was specifically talking about chemical recycling or advanced recycling. Those are basically waste to energy processes. There's a lot of hoo-ha about we're going to take the plastic and turn it back into plastic. And, mostly what they do is they turn it into pyrolysis oil, and then they burn the pyrolysis oil. And so that is incineration. I think plastic, what we think of as recycling for plastics, the kind of traditional mechanical recycling where the plastic is ground up, sorted, cleaned, ground up into small fragments, sorted again. That is problematic in itself, but it's not, I wouldn't call it incineration. I mean, it is being melted and turned into, it's usually downcycled into a lower grade product. I wouldn't call that incineration. But certainly a lot of this, there's a big effort to call a lot of incineration things recycling, right? So even the waste energy industry likes to talk about just straight up burning plastic in incinerators. Like, look, we're converting it to energy. That's a form of recycling. So the recycling word gets tossed around a lot, and you need to be very careful with who's using it to refer to what.
excellent. And Susan Steinhauser, I think you probably can come off of mute. So if you want to come off of mute and ask your question of Mackenzie, that would be great.
Thank you. This question is for Mackenzie and anybody on this call who lives in Monroe County, Miami-Dade, Broward, or Palm Beach County, who are all four counties are part of the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact. Period, right? The summit is the actual meeting. RCAP 3.0, Regional Climate Action Plan. I posted in the chat an excerpt from it. And when I read that excerpt, what I gather from that is that the leaders in these four counties appear to think that waste to energy should be part of the climate action plan and is part of zero waste. So my question is twofold. Number one, were you, Mackenzie, anyone else on here, aware of the fact that that's in there? It's baked into the climate action plan. Secondly, it was recently brought to my attention, thank you, Dr. Jody Berman, that Broward County is reaching out to folks asking for input for ReCap 4.0, looking for input from us. I just learned about that yesterday. So hopefully we'll get to use that in the future, a way to let the county know that it should not be in there. And thirdly, I'm sure this action is helping us reach out to our local elected officials. But I'm hoping that somebody on this call will be able to highlight to all 4 county leaders, sustainability directors, that incineration should not be and must not be part of RCAP 4.0. So that was a loaded question, sorry.
Thank you, Susan, for that question. So yeah, no, I actually wasn't aware of that, but I'm not surprised because within Miami-Dade's climate action plan, it has that very same language there. Unfortunately, when groups like us have present ideas and solutions that better our communities, what ends up happening is the opposition ends up co-opting the language and adding it onto their existing work, right? So they're lumping zero waste with incineration work, and honestly those are fundamentally opposing each other. You can't have a zero waste plan and build an incinerator. The incinerator, it's costly to build. Like I showed you, they're Miami-Dade, they're looking to build a $1 billion incinerator, and so that'll require a contract of at least 30 years for it to keep producing and make back its money that's being put down. And so a lot of the trash that is going to be used is going to be pumped into that trash burning facility, and you can't have that zero waste plan, a true zero waste plan, and continue to burn trash. And so while I was unaware of that specific plan, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised because I see it in other climate action plans in Florida. And so yeah, no, we definitely have our work cut out for us to educate our community, educate not just our community members, but our elected officials. They need to be aware and understand that, hey, like just be aware that these aren't the options. A lot of elected officials, they look at the quick and the quick and easy way of going about it. It's like, oh, this is easy. Let me handle this. And so we got to let them know that these are harmful to our communities. They're harmful to our health. And they're extremely costly, and they don't do what they say they're doing. And we're doing that within Florida Rising. I know a lot of other groups in this space are doing it across the state. Yeah, we're doing the work to educate them on incineration. I was actually at a top of legislative session. I was at a Black Caucus meeting, and providing that education. And a lot of them, that was the first time hearing about the harms and the impacts that are being faced. And so once we do that education process, then the next step is the accountability. We want to make sure that they uphold and stick to what we're saying, and really try to push forward what a true zero waste plan is. And that's what we're doing in Miami-Dade, and hoping to spread it across and partner with other groups to continue that pushing that messaging and assure that we don't get co-opted. That was long-winded, but that's my answer.
It's a valid
Thank
answer.
you.
Thank you.
And I will I'll just say, and there are actually now at this point more questions than we have time to answer them in. I'm gonna put the bottom line of what I think is Patricia's question, which is a good question. Her community has stopped household recycling, and everything is waste energy, and saying it's clean. She knows it's not, but also we're hearing, and I've heard this a lot myself, that there is no market for recycling. And is that true? And what can be done about that? And then I'll also encourage our speakers to go ahead and do answer in the questions if you in the chat if you can. But who's got a recycling? What do we do about recycling not being recycled?
I'm figuring Neil has a lot more history on this than I do, but I will say that the market's it's a market, right? So it ebbs and flows. There's market for specific plastics and not for other plastics, and that's part of the problem of the commingling of plastics. And it depends on how well the recycling facility actually sorts out their materials as well. Like better sorting gets them better market value. To backtrack a little bit, the other recycling, metals, glass, paper, cardboard, those are happening. Those are real. And there is a market for those, and those continue. And so the fact that the municipality is lumping them all together is problematic, right? Those are very different processes, very different levels of productivity. Those are things that can be recycled time and time and time again, where plastics can only actually be mechanically recycled once or twice, depending on kind of the quality of the plastic to begin with. So there's a lot going on in that question. It's definitely not a good thing. And I think there was another part of the question that I've now forgotten that was like a piece of it. But I don't recall.
I
Sorry.
think it was, yeah, is it true? And it sounds like you're saying not entirely, because there's ways that they're grouping things together that don't need to be done. And then what can be done with that was the other half of it.
Yeah, fight your government. It's
Yeah.
kind of the answer.
All right,
Honestly,
so
the easiest answer, and it's not usually a good one.
right, yeah, thank you. So I'm gonna Marshall is gonna do the final question, and then I'm gonna turn it over to Brian. Go ahead, Marcel.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, this question around from Ian McDonald. I apologize if I missed this at the beginning of the program, but many Connecticut officials seem to be pushing European-style incinerators as a new option to deal with waste, despite high dioxin levels found around these facilities. Can you say more about these types of facilities, as there is one such facility being proposed in North Haven, Connecticut right now? Thinking, Neil, do you have any thoughts on sort of that European incinerator myth piece there?
Yeah, so the Europeans are fighting their incinerators pretty hard. The European Union brought in a landfill directive, which they were trying to reduce the amount of waste going to landfills, which, if you think about it in isolation, is a reasonable thing to do. But what that ended up doing was pushing a lot of waste to incinerators. And so now they've realized that mistake. They're reforming the landfill directive, and they're trying to bring down their the amount of waste that they're incinerating. We've got countries like Denmark, which is a big exporter of incinerators. They've got a huge incinerator industry going around the world selling incinerators. But the government of Denmark is saying, oh, if we're going to meet our climate goals, we have to reduce the amount of waste that we're incinerating. So their big Copenhagen incinerator that you've probably seen photos of with the ski slope on it and all the like bells and whistles, that's one of the ones that they're trying to close down because it is impairing their ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then you have countries like Sweden and the Netherlands and Germany, which again have big industries, heavy industries. They built a bunch of incinerators. And then their people were like, well, we don't like this. We're going to start recycling. And again, as Jess was saying, this is mostly not plastic recycling per se, which is not particularly recyclable, but mostly other materials. And now those incinerators have to import waste from other countries to keep burning. Why don't they shut them down? Well, they've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in building these facilities. They have to pay that money back. So this is the lock-in problem. Once you build an incinerator, you are committed for decades to feeding that beast. And a number of countries are discovering this. So there is a big push now within the European Union to try and bring down those incinerators. And as I was trying to spotlight in my report, greenhouse gas emissions are one of the major concerns. But even with European technology, European level monitoring, European level management of those incinerators, they are still major toxic threats. And we are seeing that in, in countries where you would expect really the biggest, best, cleanest technology, most advanced technology, and they're still having trouble meeting their own emissions norms. So I think the European Union took a multi-decadal swing in the wrong direction, and now they're trying to change course, and it is going to be hard and expensive for them to do so. We have an opportunity to avoid their mistakes, cut off that big bend in the river, and go straight to a zero waste approach.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna turn it over to Brian real quick. I do want him to go ahead and do the action since we're right at 7:30. So Brian, can you do that? And also if anybody, all of our speakers, if you want to put your contact information in the chat or how we can find out more about your particular efforts, then that would be great. Go ahead, Brian.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks to all of the presenters. There's a lot of good info in here. So we like to take action whenever we have a presentation and engage the folks that show up at our events with their elected officials as much as possible. So I've created a very simple action to use if you live in Florida. And I know we've got some folks from out of state here. My database for this action only has Florida in it. So I encourage you to write your local elected officials on your own. But you can use this QR code, or you can use the link in the chat that I believe Kim dropped. And that is going to take you to a page that looks something like this. And you're going to click on start writing. Well, it'll give you an option to put in your name, address, how you heard about the event, that sort of thing. And this is tagged to county commissions by zip code. So if you enter your address and your zip code, and for some reason, when you click next, you see the wrong county, please let me know in the chat, and we will figure out how to work around that. This is the brand new first time I've used this database, so I apologize that we're beta testing it here. So you're gonna click start writing after you input your contact info, and it's going to give you a sample letter. I strongly encourage you to change the subject so that all of your county commissioners, if you live in the same county as other people that are on this call, so that all of your county commissioners aren't getting the exact same subject email, because that it does not look personalized, and they will ignore it. And I strongly encourage you to take some personal item, something maybe that you took from the presentation, or something going on in your own personal life that you think is relevant. Maybe you are in Lee County and you've got an incinerator that's going to be that's been proposed, and you want to talk about that, but make it personal, because they'll respond to a personal message, and they may not respond as much if they see a dozen of the exact same message worded the exact same way. So that's all you got to do. And then you click on send letter. It will send your email to all of your county commissioners. So I didn't have an easy way to just do this by district or anything like that. If you have a relationship with your county, with a county commissioner, then you probably already have their email address, and you might want to get in touch with them, not using an app like this. But this is just a way to introduce yourself to your county commissioner and introduce the issue. So it's got a couple of small facts. It says we're opposed to any definition of zero waste that includes incineration, and talks about some health effects and pollution effects. Please personalize it. Please add in some stuff that isn't already in there. And let me know in the chat if your county shows up wrong, and we might ask you to actually I might just give you their email addresses and let you use it via email. Do we see anyone in the chat that's saying their county is showing up wrong?
I do not. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate seeing y'all, and I'm so glad everyone came. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Great for you all to be here. I know that there's some questions that didn't get answered. If it's all right with the speakers, I'll work with them to see if we can answer any of them. And we'll be sending out the recording and other information, as well as information about the next Zoom. If you have any, if you got the Zoom, you can always re-register, but if you have the Zoom, this Zoom will work for next time. Susan Steinhauser, you look like you get the last word of the evening.
Just wanted to remind everybody that the next webinar is on March 26th. So if you haven't marked it in your calendar yet, and for those of you who are in our Climate Reality chapter, North Broward Palm Beach, this is a bonus presentation in March. That March normally we just have our get together in person, which will be our gleaning event, but please do mark the 26th as a bonus meeting. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone, and thank you to our speakers.